From house arrest to the White House, the American pastor at the center of U.S.-Turkey tensions walks free. Could his release repair relations between the NATO allies? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Andrew Brunson. His detention was at the heart of a diplomatic dispute between the U.S. and Turkey. But Pastor Andrew Brunson is now a free man. In the wake of a failed coup 2 years ago, the evangelical pastor was accused of being a spy with links to terror groups trying to overthrow the government. Brunson consistently denied the allegations and was eventually backed by Washington, which led to a further decline in relations between Turkey and the U.S. What began as a war of words between NATO allies soon became an economic battle. Washington imposed sanctions, sending Turkey's currency into freefall, sparking fears of economic collapse. But now that Brunson's been released, are U.S.-Turkey relations fully back on track? And was it a fair verdict, or did politics play a role? Randolph Nogel reports.
The lights at the end of the tunnel. After 2 years in detention, U.S. Pastor Andrew Brunson was convicted but released and allowed to return to the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump was seen as instrumental in securing his release.
We especially want to thank the administration. You really fought for us, unusually so, from the time you took office.
It's not an easy situation for Turkey either. They had a lot of difficult situations going on, and I do want to thank President Erdogan for making this possible.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said the Turkish judiciary reached the decision to release Brunson independently. But the circumstances of how it happened have raised questions. Several witnesses recanted their testimony. The court then found Brunson guilty and sentenced him to more than 3 years in prison, but then released him, citing time already served. Brunson was formally indicted in March 2016 on charges of espionage and having links to terrorist organizations. He was one of tens of thousands of people who were arrested in a government investigation into the outlawed PKK and the group known in Turkey as FETÖ, or the Fethullah terrorist organization. Ankara says Fethullah Gulen, a cleric and businessman now living in the United States, planned the attempted coup in July of 2016, which failed to topple Erdogan and his government. Washington's refusal to extradite him has been a source of tension between Turkey and the U.S., as have Turkey's plans to buy a Russian missile defense system, the jailing of a Turkish banking executive in the U.S., and perhaps most significantly, U.S. support for the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK. But Brunson's detention was what brought U.S.-Turkey relations to a new low. The Trump administration decided to take action instead of bartering.
If Turkey does not take immediate action to free this innocent man of faith and send him home to America, the United States will impose significant sanctions on Turkey until Pastor Andrew Brunson is free.
Trump's government followed through on the threat. In August, it doubled tariffs on steel and aluminum imports coming from Turkey. The Turkish lira then nosedived in value against the dollar.
NATO'da beraber olacaksın. Ondan sonra kalkıp stratejik ortağını sırtından vurmaya yöneleceksin. Böyle bir şey kabullenilebilir mi?
Now Donald Trump has suggested the measures against Turkey could be eased.
Well, we were very tough on Turkey, and we'll take a look. There was absolutely no deal made. Frankly, the only deal, if you could call it a deal, is a psychological one. We feel much different about Turkey today than we did yesterday.
And for now, relief, not only for Andrew Brunson and his family, but for two countries with a great deal at stake in their relationship. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Thank you. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by former U.S. diplomat and White House official Matthew Breiser. Also with us is Faruk Loolu, who served as the Turkish ambassador to the United States. And we have Onur Erim, who's a political analyst and author. And completing our panel in Concord, New Hampshire, is Katrina Lantos-Sweat. She is the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Katrina, let me begin with you. So Brunson's back home. He's got a hero's welcome back home. He met with the president at the White House. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think all Americans welcome and really celebrate the release of Pastor Brunson. He was innocent of these charges. They were not credible from the beginning. And so, mingled with our celebration and our joy at his release is concern about the state of rule of law in Turkey and the importance for Turkey to return to a greater adherence to the standards that it professes to abide by, but have come under considerable stress and pressure in recent years in Turkey.
Okay, Onur Erim. So we're hearing from Katrina. She's obviously happy that he's been released, but she's saying he's innocent. That's not what the judge had decided. The judge said, no, he's actually guilty of terror charges, but time served, plus, you're almost at the 3-year mark, you can go. Does she have a point that he was actually innocent?
Well, not according to Turkish courts. He was sentenced. He was found guilty, sentenced. We don't know the details of the, because it just didn't come out yet, what the sentencing is about. But we'll see. And do not forget, although he was released because of time served, the punishment he got is, I think, 3 years and 1 month. And according to Turkish law, with the you serve about half your time. So he's out. But also, don't forget, the prosecutor is has either appealed or is gonna appeal the decision, asking for 10 years.
Right.
So technically,
but he's back in the U.S. I mean, would that
back in the US.
actually happen?
Well, it could happen. He just,
Right.
once he steps in, he would be jailed if that is so.
Let me save my toughest question for one of the two ambassadors or both of them, because you're used to this as diplomats. Faruk Loolu, let me start with you. For those who look at it and say, well, the man was going to spend possibly 35 years on terror and espionage charges, suddenly he's out. Was there a deal politically?
According to both sides, there was no deal. This is what President Trump said very clearly, and we haven't heard anything from the Turkish side to the effect that there was a deal. But the denial of a deal does not mean that the two sides have not been talking to each other over the past year, especially over the past few months, because there are a lot of problems to be resolved between Turkey and the U.S. So the release of Pastor Brunson, an issue which literally took hostage the Turkish-American agenda, is providing a chance, an opportunity to the two sides to now go into real problems, about which I assume there has been a lot of talk. And I think in the next few days we will see in which direction, toward what issues these background talks will go. My hunch is that one of the first issues that will come up for discussion will be the U.S. sanctions toward Iran.
And I want to get and I want to get into that in a few moments. But let's first sort of like establish a baseline here. Matthew Bryza, deal or no deal?
Well, there was a deal that had been agreed in principle in August, and it involved several factors, including the release of Pastor Brunson, done in a way that would have been, I think, in accordance with the legal system here in Turkey and the courts doing what they need to do. President Trump claimed it was his pressure subsequently that led to the release. From my perspective, it was his public threatening tweets, the sanctions applied against 2 Turkish ministers, as well as a doubling of steel and aluminum sanctions tariffs that actually broke that agreement apart, that broke down the negotiation process and ended up in Pastor Brunson staying in prison or in house arrest for another 2 months.
Right. So, Katrina, let's look at it from this perspective, right? If there's a doubt about the Turkish judicial system, and if what Matthew Bryza is saying is true, then U.S. pressure twisted the arm of the Turkish justice system. It worked to Brunson's favor, so why complain?
Well, my concern is really on behalf of the direction that Turkey is going more broadly. This is a specific human rights case. As I say, everybody celebrates Pastor Brunson's release, perhaps with the exception of the Turkish prosecutor. But as we know, in the aftermath of the 2016 attempted coup, there has been a massive crackdown in Turkey, and there are huge numbers, tens of thousands of people who were either detained or fired from their jobs in a process that does not comport with the standards of law and justice that Turkey itself should aspire to. So, we have a very specific case, and, you asked whether there was a deal. I don't think there was an explicit deal, but in the relations between nations, there is almost always a spoken or an unspoken quid pro quo. And so I would assume that there will be improvement in Turkish-American relations following the release of the pastor. And I think most people would say that's a positive thing. Turkey is an incredibly important country. Turkey is a member of NATO, and we want there to be productive relations between the United States and Turkey. But I think the case of Pastor Brunson sheds light on deeper problems within the Turkish legal system and political system, and I hope that this will also be a positive sign in terms of addressing some of those.
So, Onur Erim, address that for us. So we have Katrina saying she's folding in Pastor Brunson's case into the arrests made in the aftermath of the failed coup. Is there some credibility to that, or was this man an isolated case completely?
Honestly, having spoken to a lot of people involved with this case, my honest opinion, my personal opinion, without naming anybody, is that Pastor Brunson, we know Pastor Brunson has had some extensive relationship with a couple of people that we know to be PKK members. He doesn't deny it, they don't deny it, there's pictures, there's extensive things. Now, one of the comments that I had heard from a fellow colleague in Izmir is that I think we made the biggest mistake of bringing the Brunson case out as a FETÖ case. It is not. It is a PKK case. Now, everybody had been saying, especially President Trump, that this is a decent Christian serving his faith. Well, then somebody has to come out and tell me where exactly in the gospel does it say, "Thou shall go and deal with the terrorist groups of an ally nation."
Okay, but interestingly, you say that FETÖ was probably the weaker of the charges.
Probably not.
Because for many people who look at it, they go, how can you be PKK and FETÖ at the same time? Is that, so would you accept that that's part of the weakness
but also
of the case?
don't forget, in the last few years, 3, 4, 5, whatever, whichever case you're looking at, PKK and FETÖ had been falling under the same lines in many cases. So from what I understand, Pastor Brunson's dealings with FETÖ or his relationship is probably coincidental to a certain degree. But his relationship with PKK is solid.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's move forward a little bit, and let me give you the opportunity, Ambassador Lolu, to talk about the lifting of the sanctions. When Trump says, well, now perhaps we'll take a look at the sanctions, perhaps we'll look at a thaw, what does this mean? Does this mean that this is the beginning of all these things being ticked off and all these entanglements that have caused trouble between Turkey and the United States being untangled?
No, not at all. I mean, the Turkish-American relationship is far, far away from that point. Pastor Brunson's release will now enable the two sides to come together to take up real life issues in the order in which they prefer. I mean,
what do you mean by real life issues? Explain that.
Bilateral issues and regional issues.
Right.
Bilaterally, we have the issues of extradition, the Halkbank issue. We have the S-400 missiles from Russia, and the reaction in the Congress connecting to F-35, the delivery of F-35 fighter craft to Turkey. Bilaterally, we are talking about Syria, Iraq, Iran. There are, these are the real life issues. All we have is an opportunity. I mean, President Trump spoke very optimistically. We are going back to the old days of good relations. We are going to have a wonderful relationship. That's too much. I think that's too much enthusiasm. I think both sides must approach their relationship and their problems realistically and take up the issues that are close to a potential resolution in their relationship. Right. Among these, I think, as I tried to say a little earlier, Turkey's first priority should be the Iranian sanctions.
Okay, and that's interesting, and it's also connected to the Halkbank issue. I mean, there's a basket of issues.
It's a basket of issues,
so
and you have to untangle them.
Right. Okay. So Matthew Breiser, in terms of what is realistic and what's not, because we've had Farooq Lawal say, okay, there's some that are realistic, some that are not. The extradition of Fethullah Gulen, is that realistic or not?
It's not realistic on the current trajectory, whereby the Turkish government dumped 75 boxes of documents on some poor soul's desk in the Department of Justice in totally disorganized fashion. It is realistic if the Turkish government decides to pursue its own legal research, builds its own case, a case with strong lawyers that could hold up in court, and that therefore would convince a judge to allow the extradition. To put it a different way, I think Fethullah Gulen himself has no constituency, no political constituency in the United States as a person, nor does his organization. And I even understand that the FBI has been investigating his organization in the United States. So ironically, this is an area where the U.S. and Turkey could improve their cooperation.
That's really interesting. Onur Erim, is it more a case of U.S. intransigence, as a lot of people in Turkey believe, or the fact that the Turkish government hasn't made its argument well enough, strongly enough? It's just dumped a bunch of boxes on somebody's desk. Some paper pusher, some intern maybe at the Justice Department. But this idea that Turkey hasn't explained fully just what this means and how dangerous this man is to justify an extradition. Which one is it?
Bill Devin, who I believe is an evangelical pastor that has been, that's friends of Mr. Brunson, Pastor Brunson, and has been in Turkey a number of times in the last year or so. And he was here when he was being, his sentencing was being explained. On the way out, in an interview, he said that I spoke to a couple of U.S. diplomats, and they said this is the most, the longest running examining of any kind of a extraditionary file in the history of the United States. Well, you know what? I think it will just go on. I don't think this will come to an end unless there's a political decision. Just last week, if you remember, that there was a so-called shooting by an intruder into the FETÖ compound in PA. Well, we're talking about a compound whose vice president, a guy by the name of Sablak, owns about 20 patents on surveillance cameras in the world. Information thanks to a friend of ours, John Favre in PA. Yet, there's not a single picture of this guy. So, when it comes to FETÖ, they know how to conceal what they're doing. And when it comes to the United States, I don't think they're ready politically.
Why aren't they ready, though? Why would they keep him?
I mean, every kind of answer that I would try to give this would be a conspiracy theory. But the fact of the matter is, and I keep asking this for a year right now, you got an ally like Turkey, you got a very serious accusation. Would you, as a State Department, as FBI, anybody in D.C., would you not have at least called this guy once for questioning? And there's your answer.
Katrina Lantos-Sweat, are we seeing the realpolitik of it all, that when two big, powerful nations have tensions, we're going to have the human rights of different people and, I guess, the individual cases being collateral damage here? They're going to be pawns between two nations.
Well, you know, that's a somewhat cynical view, although I couldn't say that it's completely ungrounded in reality. I would like to say a word about the possible extradition of Fethullah Gulen. I think that it is very unlikely, because I think that the evidence is not there to justify such an action. And absent overwhelmingly compelling evidence, it would violate all standards of rule of law in the United States to extradite this individual under such circumstances. So I think it's highly unlikely, and I hope that it will remain highly unlikely, because I think that that would be an example of cynical realpolitik.
Okay, but
I do think...
But hold on for a second, Katrina, just for a second, if you don't mind, and I apologize for interrupting. You haven't seen what's in the boxes, right? You haven't seen what's in the documents. I haven't seen. Nobody on this panel has seen what's in the boxes. So how would we know that Turkey hasn't provided ample evidence?
Well, I'm all for a thorough investigation, and I think that investigation has been ongoing. As was said, a large amount of material was handed over to the Justice Department, and so this has been ongoing. I actually have, some connections there at the Justice Department, and what I have heard is that there is not evidence that would be considered credible by American legal standards. So, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that float around. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. One of your guests just mentioned that because of the patents that a particular individual holds, that somehow that raises some elements of suspicion. That's not the way the law works. The law needs to work on the basis of actual evidence. So yes, I'm happy to concede that I have not seen those 70 boxes of documents. None of us have personally. But on the basis of what I know, that's my considered judgment on that matter. But on the broader question you asked of realpolitik and how it intersects with our commitment to fundamental values, I'm a human rights activist. So of course I believe that our strength, the strength of any country, comes from its adherence to certain fundamental principles, because those principles, rule of law, the presumption of innocence, the protection of basic rights, freedom of religion, conscience, and belief, because these are so essential to building strong, stable, tolerant, pluralistic societies, these values not only serve our higher ideals, but they actually serve our values of wanting stable, prosperous, peaceful societies.
Certainly. But Katrina, is there any evidence that Pastor Brunson was persecuted for his evangelical beliefs?
I think, well, look, I served for 4 years on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I served 2 terms as chair of that commission. And there are tremendous issues around freedom of religion, conscience, and belief in Turkey. So I think that the fact that he was an evangelical pastor in some senses made it easier for the government to target and to persecute him. I think there were other factors, but, one of your guests mentioned that he felt there was very strong evidence relative to the pastor's involvement with the PKK. I would strongly dispute
I didn't
that.
say strong evidence. I said concrete evidence, ma'am.
Okay, well, concrete evidence, I accept that revision. A pastor, a minister, certainly within the Christian faith, seeks to extend ministering help to all people in need. And it's my understanding that the church in Izmir had no involvement with anything that could be construed even remotely as political, let alone involved with terrorism. That there's just simply no credible evidence of that. And circumstantial evidence saying, my goodness, this church may have provided food or meals or some other ministering pastoral help to individuals in need.
So it would be okay for Turkish imams to go preach Quran into Syria or Iraq to ISIS or other terrorist groups, from what you're saying?
Well, I think that when somebody has a purely faith-based mission and purpose, we do not hold them accountable for the beliefs or the behavior of those who may hear their message.
Okay,
yes,
and this is you two will clearly disagree on this, and that is an interesting analogy that Onur has given, and I'd love to expand on it maybe another time, because it's a fascinating comparison. Let me go to Ambassador Farukloğlu. Let's imagine you're back in your old job, and this has just happened. What do you think would be the first priority now for somebody representing Turkey in the United States in trying to mend ties and build on the momentum of Brunson's release? What would be the first thing that needs to be done?
In terms of specific issues, I would, I think, start with the Iranian sanctions, because the second party of sanctions will go into effect on the 4th of November. So it's very close. There is not much time. And I'm sure the topic has been the subject of discussions already. Turkey has declared we will not abide by the sanctions, and U.S. said we will not give anybody an exception vis-a-vis Iranian sanctions. That's the publicly stated positions. The second issue, of course, will be Syria. What happens in Syria with PYD, YPG, and East of Euphrates? These are all very.
And it's interesting because it's all interconnected, because the very support of the PYD, YPG, and the connection, alleged connection between Brunson and the PKK is folded in. It's an issue of disagreeing on the parameters here. who's a terrorist and who's not, right? And this is also fascinating. Again, we're running out of time. Matthew Breiser, we've sat on the show and discussed issues such as Turkey and Russia's relationship at a point in time seemingly irreparable. And then overnight things turn. Is the same possibly going to happen with the United States?
I think so. I think it's possible, but yeah, as Ambassador Lolu said, the problems out there are still quite serious and they need to be disentangled from each other. But I think the seeds of a quick turnaround are in place. Manbij plan. There's a good plan on the table, worked out between the United States and Turkish militaries. The militaries are now training together and will hopefully soon begin their joint patrols. And I think that the model there hopefully will succeed, that will disentangle the YPG issue on one spot on the map in Manbij and hopefully be replicated in the area east of the Euphrates.
Okay, well, we've sort of opened up a bunch of interesting issues here. They could all be expanded upon. Unfortunately, I'm out of time. I have to move on to another segment. But I want to thank you all sincerely for joining us on the Newsmakers. Matthew Breiser, Faruk Loolu, Onur Erim, and Katrina Lantos-Sweat. Thanks again. Still to come on the program, a political earthquake rocks Bavaria. Angela Merkel's allies suffer heavy losses in the state election. Is the German Chancellor's coalition crumbling? And it's been 1 year since a massive truck bomb killed almost 600 people in Mogadishu. We asked the man who was mayor at the time if enough's been done to improve security in Somalia. Before Sunday's state election in Bavaria, Angela Merkel's coalition was already looking fragile. Now it appears to be in crisis. Sunday's vote saw the Christian Social Union suffer its worst result in almost 70 years, losing its overall majority. While they were humiliated, success was split between the Greens and the far-right AfD. The anti-immigration party will now enter the Bavarian parliament for the first time. Could this spell the beginning of the end for Merkel's time in office? Haider Abbasi takes a look.
It's written all over their faces. A humiliation for the Christian Social Union. After dominating Germany's state of Bavaria for decades, the party's had one of its worst election results. Angela Merkel's coalition partner lost its absolute majority in the state's parliament. Bavaria's premier, however, seems undeterred.
Aber eines steht auch fest.
One thing is clear, despite some prognosis, discussions and comments, the CSU is not only the strongest party, but it also received a clear mandate to govern.
But it's an undeniably weaker mandate. Initial results show the CSU won 37% of the vote. It's the party's worst result since the 1950s. This is seen as bad news for the Chancellor. She formed a coalition with the CSU and the Christian Social Democratic Party in March. Now it's looking vulnerable. But there was success elsewhere on Sunday. The Green Party won 18%, more than doubling its share of the vote.
Bavaria now needs a political party that solves people's problems instead of continually producing new problems. And therefore, dear friends, this election result has already changed Bavaria. So thank you very much.
And the Anti-Immigration Alternative for Germany, or AfD, won 10% of votes. The far-right party enters Bavaria's parliament for the first time. It's already the main opposition in the Bundestag. And as far as the AfD is concerned, they could easily soon be over for Angela Merkel.
The CSU on around 33%. The SPD on around 10%, with no room to go down. It could even be 9%. That is no longer a grand coalition in Berlin. That is a mini coalition, which no longer represents the will of voters in any way. Therefore, clear the way for new elections.
Bavaria is Germany's biggest state, with at least 13 million people and the country's economic engine. But even a booming economy couldn't sway the voters. Infighting between the CSU's leader, Horst Seehofer, and Merkel has seen the party lose important support. The Chancellor was heavily criticized by Seehofer, for her refugee policy. Since 2015, Germany has accepted more than 1 million asylum seekers. But many believe the CSU was acting more like Alternative for Germany and decided to ditch the party. The quarrelling almost led to the collapse of the coalition. Germany has another state election in 2 weeks in Hesse. If there's another poor result for the coalition, could Merkel be forced to call an election? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Berlin is Matthew Karniching. He's Politico's chief Europe correspondent. And in Vienna is political analyst Klaus Jürgens. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Matthew, let me begin with you. So Bavaria has its election. There are people who see it as a major blow to Angela Merkel. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. There's no doubt that it's a blow to her, because even though this isn't her party, it's her close ally, and there's no doubt that her policies, in particular on migration, played a major role in the campaign down there, and were one of the reasons that the Bavarian party, the CSU, did so poorly.
Klaus, why do you think people didn't vote for the CSU?
Well, thank you for being on the show. I beg to differ perhaps with a few basic outlines. I think it was not only voting for or against the Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel. I think what we see in Bavaria is a much wider change in society regarding values, regarding issues, regarding topics. Yes, it was a kind of red card, definitely for the Grand Coalition, but I think we should need to address a number of issues which in particular affected and impacted the Bavarian vote.
Okay, so tell me, what's the major issue, Klaus?
Well, I, of course, followed the elections very closely, and yes, the infighting within the CSU was a big issue. The question of whether the CSU would support Chancellor Merkel in the long run, or rather not, most definitely. But then we went deeper, and when you analyze opinion polls and surveys about what really matters to the Bavarian people, it seems that initially it was all about the high cost of rent, children's education and kindergartens, environmental issues. There was always the migration issue and the Berlin issue, but I am not entirely certain whether it was not perhaps much more of a Bavarian election instead of a national, federal election, issue-wise.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So, Matthew, for those who want to see Bavaria as a microcosm of the national debate, they should be cautious, basically, according to Klaus. Bavaria is Bavaria, and it's not all of Germany. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree. I don't agree at all. And if that were the case, then the Social Democrats, the SPD, wouldn't have fallen from over 20% to under 10%. They just recorded their worst regional election in the party's 150-year history. And the Social Democrats are not in power in Bavaria. And I think on that front alone, you can see that this was clearly a referendum on the Grand Coalition. And, you know, of course, these situations are never monocausal. I mean, you know, this is a problem that we journalists have, I think, is that we tend to look for one cause. There wasn't one cause, but if you look back over the past several years, I don't think there's any doubt that the problems for the CSU began in 2015 when Merkel decided to open the borders, or to leave the borders open. That was a decision that was very controversial in Bavaria. And there's some people who disagree with it. There's some people who agree with it, but that is really what infused the political debate there and really loomed large in the campaign. Now, it might not be an issue that every voter in Bavaria would cite. And, you know, as we just heard, there are certainly other issues as well. There are issues like housing, there are issues like education and so forth. But I would argue that those are things that voters are always worried about. They're always worried about health. They're always worried about pensions and this type of thing. But what was the one issue that really infused the election this time? And I would say that it was migration.
Right. So, Klaus, we see the CSU, as we mentioned, not doing as well as Merkel and her friends would have liked them to do, her coalition partners, the Social Democrats, getting less than 10%. And we're seeing the Greens doing better than expected, and AfD on the far right getting, 10%. Is there, would you agree, an argument to be made that in Bavaria and throughout the country, the middle is getting hollowed out. The middle is going, and we're seeing more politics of, I don't want to say the extremes, but of the left and the right rather than the center.
This is extremely vital point, if I may say so, with all modesty. Yes, indeed. If what we see now, the social democratic movement, which even in Bavaria was at a time in the history well above the 30% mark, is losing ground. And if in other European countries social democracy as such apparently seems to provide answers, now it is no surprise that voters look elsewhere. Would they look to the far left? Not necessarily. Would they look to another left party? We saw in Bavaria just over 3%. Would they look to alternative views? One, definitely the Greens, and one might be the far right. I fully agree. The center seems to be being hollowed out. I am not saying that conservative parties have the best answers in this regard. I am saying that the center left simply does not provide any alternatives, including in Sweden, for example. It's a very dangerous development.
Right.
I'm very worried about
certainly
far-right parties gaining ground, but fully agree, yes, it is definitely hollowed out. Yes.
And Klaus, help me understand why the Greens got almost 18%. What was in the magic within their appeal?
Well, yesterday I followed live the first press conference, and we call it the round of elephants in a nice way, the Elefantenrunde, when the party chairwomen and party chairmen come together. The Green Party representative basically issued the environmental concerns that we need to have a different approach towards how to safeguard our lands, environmentally safe, what do we build on it, what do we eat, what do we do with industry. It was a pretty much traditional green viewpoint, but traditional would not have gotten them this result they have. There are some commentaries in Germany saying actually the Green Party would be on the way to become a new Volkspartei, a new People's Party. Now this morning I watched another press conference live on behalf of the Greens, and they said, no, we do not want to be another Volkspartei or People's Party. The People's Parties actually have lost these elections, and we see ourselves as an alternative. Now, it is no longer the alternative vote as such. It is no longer students or supposedly left-leaning people. Some people argue it is basically some form of middle-class, positively speaking, yuppie movement, who now turn to the Greens and push them because the traditional people's parties have lost. Do they want to become a people's party? From what I heard today, now on the way into the opposition, as it seems today, as the CSU and the Freie Wähler, the Free Voters, most likely form a coalition. We don't know, but it is fascinating to see that in a traditional German federal state like Bavaria, a Green Party scores so well at the ballot box.
Right, and it's interesting because a lot of people say that Bavaria is quite conservative by default. Maybe it's not. Matthew, some people want a spikier alternative with a lot of teeth to the far right, the AfD. Now, I guess there's two ways to look at it. One way to look at it is to say, assuming that far-right politics is dangerous and xenophobia is not a nice thing, some people would say, well, 10%, that's worrying. And others would say, oh, 10%, 1 in 10, chill out. It's not a big deal. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I wouldn't say it's not a big deal, but it certainly isn't keeping with the trends that we've seen elsewhere in Europe. And it's not as bad in some other parts of Germany, in fact, or in some neighboring countries, in Austria, for example, or in Hungary, in Poland, and places like that. So I don't think it's something that people need to get hysterical about. And I would disagree that the center is eroding in Bavaria. At the end of the day, the Greens are also a centrist party, just as the SPD is, just as the CDU is. So even though the Greens did well, if you look at the overall figures of the parties who are on the center left, the Social Democrats and the Greens, they didn't do as well as they did 5 years ago in 2013. They did slightly worse, whereas conservative parties, which include the CSU and the AfD and the Free Voters and the FDP, they did slightly better. They got 64% of the vote. So Bavaria remains very conservative. We've just seen a shift away from the parties who are in power in Berlin to other alternatives. And I think that the most interesting thing is that most of the CSU voters who left the the CSU tent did not go to the AFD, but they went to the Freie Wähler, to the Free Voters, which are now going to likely be the next coalition partner here.
So, Klaus, if Angela Merkel called you in and said, what does this Bavaria election tell me about the political pulse in the country, even though earlier you said Bavaria is Bavaria and it must be separated, if she called you in and said, I'm worried after these election results, I don't want to lose federally, what should I do? How do I keep power with my coalition? What would you advise her, Klaus?
Well, with all modesty, I think the CSU embarked on a course of infighting, including to challenge Chancellor Merkel. And I think what most people who are now disenfranchised from mainstream politics do not want to see is infighting, bickering, talking negatively about behind one's back. What they want to see are clear solutions to the problems they face. We can argue, of course, is it more about the migration? Is it more about the rent? Is it more closer to home or to your pocket? But definitely the voter seems to be disenfranchised from politics in general. This is what the press conference this morning discussed as well. Why do people vote differently than they did in the past? Is it because they have more money? Is it because they have less money? Is it because things have changed in general? Or is it because perhaps they don't see politicians anymore as a true representative of themselves? Now here comes the far right. Even if they are not the true representatives of the people, they pretend to be. It's a very dangerous situation. Now, this vote was won. In 2 weeks, we have to vote in the federal state of Hessen. And what I heard this morning was everyone is playing it cool until 2 weeks' time to see how this will play out. Chancellor Merkel probably is not unhappy. Why do I say this? It's a very risque comment. She probably has the upper hand by now, because she can easily tell the sister party CSU, the way you run this election was not leading to the expected results. We don't want to see this neither in Hessen nor in any upcoming federal election. I think actually her strength has been improved instead of decreased.
I was going to wrap, but I want to give Matthew a final comment, because when you said, Klaus, that Chancellor Merkel might not be unhappy, Matthew sort of sat up in disagreement, I think. Tell me, Matthew, what you make of that comment very finally, please.
Well, I think that there's just no avoiding the fact that here her key partner in the coalition has just seen, a fifth of its support disappear, and the polls in Hesse for the regional election in 2 weeks are pointing to a similar outcome. After that, the CDU is going to have a party congress where Merkel is expected to run again, and this is just a string of defeats. And at the end of the day, there's a real question about whether she will be able to maintain the chairmanship of her party. And I just don't see how you can look at Bavaria, which is really the wealthiest region in Germany, one of the wealthiest regions in Europe. And there's no reason that her party should be losing there. And they got almost obliterated. I mean, they're holding on to power with their fingernails, but this is a real defeat for her. And I think the real question is, can her grand coalition here survive this over the next few months?
Okay, big questions. Restless and interesting time in German politics at the moment. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us, and we'll keep a close eye on those polls in a couple of weeks in Hesse. For the moment, let me thank you, Matthew Karnisching and Klaus Jürgens. Thanks again for joining us on the Newsmakers.
My husband and his sister were killed in the Sobe blast. His sister wasn't seen, but what we found was only his burnt bones. Thanks to Allah. That day was a very shocking one, but now we are recovering, thanks to Allah.
1 year ago, Somalia suffered its worst ever terror attack. At least 587 people were killed when a massive truck bomb exploded in the capital, Mogadishu. The militant group Al-Shabaab was held responsible, and on Sunday, Somali authorities executed the man accused of orchestrating the explosion. But attacks in Somalia are not uncommon. For decades, the threat of terror has plagued the country. So is enough being done to bring peace and stability to Somalia? Well, let's ask Thabit Mohammed. He was the mayor of Mogadishu at the time of the attack last year. Thanks for joining us, Thabit. It's hard to believe that it's been a year. It was horrendous. What a terrible atrocity. Let me ask you, looking back, Do you believe that more could have been done when you were in office to possibly prevent it happening?
Thank you very much, first of all. Thank you for having me to tell the story of October 14. October 14 last year was a tragic incident, and Mogadishu has experienced its most severe attack. And of course, that time, if I just recall back, and during my time at the office, Benadir Regional Administration, which is called BRA, or Mogadishu Municipality, which also I was the mayor of the city, was not, the current and the previous security structure was not under the administration. So it was directly under the federal government, particularly with the Ministry of Internal Security. So it was not coming, actually, the structure wasn't coming under Benadir administration. So what I know for sure is that, that attack was horrific. And I passed the junction, which was quite traffic, 10 minutes before the explosion. And I reached to my office, which is 4 kilometers away from the explosion scene. And I could hear the explosion as it was just right next door. I came back immediately at the scene. And the thing that I have seen was a terror, horrific incidents, because there was a life a few minutes ago when I passed there. And when I came back, there was the destruction, and the atrocities and the horrendous attack was unbelievable. And the magnitude of the explosion was even also unimaginable.
Right. And so we're looking at the execution of Hassan Aden Ishaq that just happened. We look at this news and we ask, is that justice for the people of Somalia by executing this man?
I think when it comes to the relevant institutions can answer that question, but in my opinion, I would say that, justice can only serve at its best level for the victims. And of course, we would like to hear more from the government to explain further about how the investigations were carried out and also the final execution which was done. But what matters most is just an openness and also to come forward and explain to the people about, whoever has done this. And we know that it was a terror act. We know that something that has terrorized our people, and it was the most severe attack in Mogadishu, in Somalia, and in Africa.
And in terms of what has happened afterwards, in terms of securing Mogadishu and the rest of Somalia, in terms of preventing possible terror attacks from Shabab and maybe even Daesh and maybe even Al-Qaeda remnants, is Somalia in better shape right now, and is it getting better help from the international community?
In fact, while I was in the office, I think it's worth mentioning that when I was in the office, I was only 7 months in the office before the explosion happened. And before and after, both we were lobbying for, we were advocating for to devolve the security sector so that, and also empower the local administration, which was Benadir administration. And that's not a rocket science. It has been done. We have seen best practices, such as if you look at Somaliland, it's quite calm, it's quite peaceful, than Mogadishu. If you look at Puntland, it's the same. And that, I think, the best practice is something that has been implemented, which is to create ownership for the security and empower the local administration, so that it's dealt at local level for a local benefit. And to answer the question, I think the status quo continues. The security structure has not been reformed. When I say has not been reformed, I mean exactly that it's not coming under Benadir administration. It's still under the federal government, which lacks the ownership, the same ownership as Puntland or Somaliland or Jubaland as well, especially the city of Kismayo. So I think the security structure and the reform would have been better to empower the local administration and devolve security sector as well.
And had you expressed this to President Farmajo, Mohammed?
Actually, I did during my time, and also before the tragic incident, I did, and we talked to, and I expressed this clearly during the security conference, which was held in Halane, or Adanad International Airport, inside which has been attended by the international community on November the first week of November. I clearly expressed in my remarks, and I reached out my principals as well, the leaders of the country, just to explain that the only way that the global terrorism, which is a new phenomenon, can be dealt is at local level. And at local level, when I say, is just to empower and also devolve the security sector so it has an ownership.
Right. And there are those who say beyond defeating Shabab militarily, at the root cause, you need to talk to them. Interesting op-ed written recently by the former National Security and Counterterrorism Advisor, Hussein Sheikh Ali, says, Somalia needs to talk to Shabab. That's what they need to do. I wonder what you think about that, especially given that the memory is quite fresh of what they just did a year ago and they killed almost 600 people. Would you talk to them?
I think what I would say is nothing is impossible. I think the art of politics and also the art of solution is just you have to open your door to get a peaceful solution. But in the meantime, also there must be a parallel security strategy and operations that are tangible, that are also a national plan. That's also part of, as I said again, that has an ownership at local level. So I would say that I think the president has long time ago and several times repeated amnesty and amnesty for defectors coming out from Shabab. But also I think in terms of there must be a military pressure from what is going on. But I would say nothing is impossible, and it's always good to open to open your doors for peaceful negotiations.
Thabit Mohammed, hope to have you on the Newsmakers again very soon. Thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, the deadline passes for rebel fighters to evacuate the Syrian province of Idlib. But have they withdrawn? And will the Russian-Turkish deal to avoid a bloodbath hold? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.